Lila's scream cut through the stunned crowd like glass shattering on tile, and suddenly every head snapped toward the locked venue doors where she stood trembling, insisting I had ruined her perfect day. I could barely breathe as she jabbed her finger at me, her voice cracking with humiliation while guests whispered and the coordinator avoided her eyes. She didn't know the truth. Not about the contract, not about the payments I'd made, not about the reason those doors were sealed shut. And as Ethan stared at the ground, refusing to speak, I felt the weight of a secret I'd guarded for months press hard against my ribs. Before I could defend myself, Julia stepped from the crowd with a strange shine in her eyes, like she'd been waiting years for this moment. In that instant, everything tightened. The air, the silence, the feeling that something far older than this wedding was about to finally break. And then I heard a single sentence from the venue manager that made my heart stop. Someone triggered the clause. Lila's fury didn't ease once the initial shock faded. Instead, it grew sharper, like every regret she'd ever swallowed was suddenly aimed at me. She accused me of refusing to pay the deposit, of embarrassing her in front of her guests, of always needing control. I absorbed every word, even the ones that cut so deep, I felt myself shrink inside. Ethan hovered behind her, saying nothing, forcing my silence to look like guilt. And though Ron tried to explain that the issue wasn't about refusal but a triggered contract clause, Lila couldn't hear anything past the humiliation pounding in her chest. I kept thinking I could change all of this with a single truth, but that truth would destroy her image of Ethan. And somehow, I still wanted to protect her from that. Julia slipped aside Lila like a shadow eager to be seen, her voice low enough for only her to hear, but sharp enough to slice through any logic. She whispered that I'd always ruined important moments, that I hated letting anyone else shine, that this was exactly the kind of control I wielded when we were younger. Lila's eyes widened with new outrage that wasn't hers. It was borrowed, poisoned, fed by someone who had waited decades to strike. I felt the ground shift, not from Lila's anger, but from the realization that Julia wasn't here to support her niece. She was here to watch me fall. When Ron returned with the paperwork, the crowd quieted, as though everyone sensed the moment something big was about to crack open. He didn't accuse, he didn't blame. He just pointed to the part of the contract that had been triggered because of a past issue tied to the groom's name. Ethan's face drained of color, and though Lila couldn't see it, I did. His guilt was a living thing, pulsing beneath the surface. But before Ron could say more, Lila cut him off with another accusation at me, her voice raw and terrified. She wasn't angry at the truth. She was terrified of it. By the time the guests began murmuring again, the emotional air had thinned into something sharp and dangerous. Lila looked at me like I was no longer her mother, but an enemy who had been plotting for years. Ethan stood frozen, torn between truth and self-preservation. Julia looked satisfied. And Ron, poor Ron, simply wanted someone to understand the rules he was forced to follow. As the last sliver of daylight slipped away, I realized this wasn't just a wedding disaster. This was the moment every unspoken secret, every old wound, every buried resentment finally clawed its way to the surface. And none of us had any idea what it was about to cost. Lila's anger didn't fade once we moved away from the main entrance. It ignited into something heavier, something fed by embarrassment and the fear that everyone was judging her. She paced in circles, gripping her dress so tightly the fabric wrinkled beneath her fists, insisting that I'd sabotaged everything because I couldn't stand not being in control. Ethan hovered behind her like a scared shadow, swallowing every chance to admit what he'd done. I watched the cracks forming between them, thin but dangerous, and I knew if he didn't speak soon, the blame would cement itself onto me forever. But he stayed silent, and Lila kept spiraling, trapped between humiliation and the pressure to keep pretending her life was perfect. Ethan's silence became its own betrayal. Every second he refused to speak twisted deeper into Lila's heart, turning her confusion into certainty that I was the enemy. I watched him stare at the ground, shoulders slumped, lips pressed tight like he was holding back an avalanche of truth. Ron tried again to explain the triggered clause, but Ethan stepped in front of him, blocking the conversation like he was physically shielding his secrets. And Lila, so desperate to believe her future was secure, clung to his silence as proof that I had done something unforgivable. I felt the unfairness burn inside me, but even worse was the fear that Lila wasn't ready to hear the truth, especially if it came from him. Julia moved like she owned the moment, circling closer with a kind of cold satisfaction that made the hairs on my arms rise. She didn't speak loudly, but every word she fed Lila was a seed of resentment, carefully planted, perfectly timed. She reminded Lila of every childhood disappointment, every moment she claimed I'd overstepped, twisting old stories until they no longer resembled truth. Lila listened because she was hurting, and hurt people often trust the voice that sounds most certain, even if it's laced with poison. I wanted to pull Lila away, but I knew stepping in would only make things worse, and Julia knew that better than anyone. Ron finally insisted on reviewing the contract with Lila directly, hoping clarity would calm the storm. But the moment he mentioned a requirement tied to Ethan's history, Ethan's face twitched, and Lila noticed. The first crack in her certainty appeared, small but unmistakable. She asked Ethan a simple question. "What is he talking about?" And Ethan froze completely. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the whole courtyard leaned in to hear his answer. But none came, and for the first time since the doors locked, Lila looked scared for a reason that had nothing to do with me. The moment Lila realized Ethan wasn't answering, that he couldn't answer, something shifted behind her eyes. A quiet panic, a silent unraveling. She stepped back from him, just one small step, but enough to show the truth was slipping through the lies she'd been clinging to. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her she wasn't wrong to feel terrified, but the distance between us had grown too wide. Julia watched with a kind of smug curiosity, as though she'd been waiting for this fracture. And Ethan, caught in the center of the collapse, just closed his eyes like he wished the whole world would disappear. The night air felt heavier than ever, carrying a truth none of us could outrun much longer. The courtyard had gone uncomfortably still, as if everyone sensed the shift in Lila's breathing when she realized something wasn't adding up. I watched her glance between Ethan and Ron, her panic rising each time Ethan failed to meet her eyes. Ron tried to soften the blow, explaining that the clause wasn't random. It had been activated because the venue had dealt with damage linked to Ethan's name before. That word, damage, cracked the surface of Lila's certainty. She took a half-step toward Ethan, not with anger, but with a fragile hope that he'd reassure her. But Ethan only tightened his jaw, and in the quiet that followed, I saw the first spark of suspicion flicker behind her tears. The truth wasn't just coming, it was starting to bleed through. Ron flipped through the contract again, more methodical this time, stopping at a highlighted section he hadn't noticed earlier. His brows knit together, and I felt the crowd's attention tighten around him like a vice. When he read the clause out loud, the words landed like a punch. It specifically referenced prior financial disputes in Ethan's name with other event vendors. Lila froze, jaw trembling, her breath catching as she turned slowly toward Ethan. And in that painful, suspended moment, the carefully built image of her perfect wedding, her perfect life, began to crack. Ethan whispered her name, but the sound only deepened the silence around them. I could feel her heart breaking from where I stood. Julia tried to step in, pretending to comfort Lila, but her timing was too precise and her voice too smooth. She urged Lila not to let them confuse her, insisting that I had somehow orchestrated all of this. But Lila wasn't absorbing her words anymore, not fully. She was staring at Ethan with growing dread, her breathing uneven. And for the first time, Julia's confidence wavered. She could feel the narrative slipping from her hands as Lila's eyes filled with the kind of fear no lie could silence. Ethan tried to reach for Lila, but she took a careful step back, and the collective gasp from the crowd felt like a gust of cold air. Something irreversible had begun. Ethan finally tried to explain, but every word he managed to force out only made things worse. He blamed misunderstandings, clerical errors, old issues that weren't his fault, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him. Ron corrected him gently, stating the records were clear and recent. Lila's breathing quickened, her hands shaking as she clutched the skirt of her gown. She looked at me for the first time since she'd screamed at me, not with forgiveness, but with the dawning realization that she had blamed the wrong person. I didn't reach out. I didn't speak. I just waited as the truth she had been running from finally caught up to her. Right. The final blow came when Ron hesitated, then revealed there was one more detail. The initial payment hadn't come from Ethan or Lila at all. It had come from me. The words fell into the air like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading instantly across every face. Lila's jaw slackened. Ethan flinched, and Julia's eyes narrowed with a flash of old resentment. I felt exposed, stripped bare in front of everyone, because the secret I'd guarded wasn't meant to humiliate Ethan. It was meant to protect my daughter from the shame he carried. Lila turned toward me, her expression a storm of shock, hope, and guilt all tangled together. And in that fragile moment, the truth finally began to take its rightful place. Lila stared at me like she was seeing a stranger wearing her mother's face, her breath thin and shaky, as she tried to understand why I would have paid for everything without telling her. Ron's quiet confirmation hung in the air, tightening the silence around us, until even the lanterns seemed to flicker slower. Ethan reached for her again, whispering her name as if her attention might somehow save him, but she pulled away with a tenderness that made it hurt even more. She wasn't angry yet. She was confused, fragile, and desperately trying to hold on to the version of her life she had built in her head. And as I watched the truth settle over her like a heavy blanket, I knew we had crossed a threshold there was no return from. Ethan finally broke, the pressure cracking him open all at once. Words tumbled out, late payments, unpaid balances, a history of misunderstandings with other venues he'd hoped no one would ever connect. Lila's expression shifted with every confession, her jaw tightening, her eyes glistening with disbelief. She tried to speak, but emotion strangled her voice, and instead she looked at me as if searching for something solid to cling to. I didn't move toward her. I couldn't. This wasn't my moment to save, and any comfort I offered might only deepen her shame. Ethan's voice shook harder with each admission, and when he finally said he'd planned to fix it before she ever knew, the courtyard felt colder than ever. Lila finally found her voice, and when she did, it trembled with the kind of heartbreak that comes from being blindsided by the person she trusted most. She didn't yell. She pleaded. She asked Ethan why he hadn't told her, why he'd let her believe her mother was the problem, why he'd let her scream at me in front of everyone. Ethan tried to defend himself, insisting he didn't want to ruin their big day, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I watched Lila's shoulders collapse inward, the betrayal sinking deep into her bones. And somewhere behind her, Julia's expression soured, because this wasn't the story she'd wanted to unfold. Ron stepped forward again, gently explaining the timeline of payments, the penalties, and the clause Mara had covered without hesitation. Every sentence carved deeper into Lila's shock, and with each detail, her gaze drifted toward me as if she were rediscovering who I was. I could feel the crowd pulling away emotionally, no longer looking at me with suspicion, but with quiet sympathy. Julia looked around at them, unsettled, her influence slipping from her fingers like sand. And in that unexpected shift, Lila finally whispered my name, not with blame, but with breaking realization. It felt like something inside me cracked open, releasing months of quiet ache. When Ron confirmed for the final time that I had paid everything, every fee, every penalty, every piece of her dream, Lila's knees seemed to weaken. She turned toward me slowly, her eyes shimmering with guilt, gratitude, and heartbreak all tangled together. But before she could speak, Julia stepped closer, her voice sharp as she accused me of buying affection, and controlling the family through favors. It was a desperate attempt to regain power. But Lila didn't flinch this time. Instead, she looked at Julia as if seeing her clearly for the first time. And I realized that this moment wasn't just about the wedding falling apart. It was about every hidden truth beginning to surface. Julia's voice cut through the air before anyone else could speak, dripping with bitterness she had spent years holding inside. She didn't just accuse me of controlling the wedding. She accused me of destroying her life, of taking opportunities that should have been hers, of being the sister everyone praised while she got scraps. Her words were jagged, ripped from old wounds she'd never healed. People around us shifted uncomfortably, realizing this wasn't about Lila's wedding anymore. This was a decades-old storm finally breaking open. I stood still, letting her pour out everything she'd been carrying. Because deep down, I knew this moment had been chasing us for a long, long time. I finally spoke. Not to defend myself, but to tell the truth. Julia had twisted for years. I reminded her how I'd taken extra shifts when our father got sick, how I paid her tuition when she lost her scholarship, how I lent her money she never repaid. Not because I wanted control, but because I loved her. Julia's face faltered, the fury breaking just enough to reveal the hurt beneath. But instead of softening, she doubled down, claiming my help had always felt like a reminder of her failures. The crowd was silent, Lila trembling as she realized her aunt had fueled her anger with the same resentment she'd buried for decades. And for the first time, I felt a strange clarity. Julia wasn't my enemy. She was my unfinished heartbreak. Julia exploded, accusing me of always being the hero, of getting the praise while she barely survived, of being the sister everyone compared her to. Her voice cracked mid-sentence, revealing a grief so old it no longer recognized itself. I didn't interrupt. I just let her speak until she finally ran out of breath. When I answered, my voice stayed steady. Not cold, not cruel, just honest. I told her the truth she'd never accepted, that we had the same starting point, but she resented me for surviving different. And as those words settled in the air, Julia's expression twisted between denial and recognition, like she was finally confronting a mirror she'd avoided her whole life. The weight of truth pulled the fight out of Julia all at once. Her shoulders slumped, her expression cracked, and for a brief moment she looked like the sister I remembered, hurt, lost, wanting to be understood. She whispered that she'd always felt like I took the things she wanted, and though it wasn't fair, it was real to her. I stepped closer, but not to argue, to let her know I'd never wanted her life, only to help her survive. Lila's eyes filled again, this time with a different kind of heartbreak, as she realized her mother and aunt had been trapped in the same story. She almost repeated with Ethan, blaming the wrong person for old wounds that were never healed. Never healed. When Julia finally fell silent, a fragile stillness settled over the courtyard. Lila looked between us, realizing just how deep the wounds in this family ran, how easily pain passed from one generation to the next when no one stopped to face it. She stepped closer to me slowly, like she wasn't sure she deserved to, and in her eyes I saw the shift I'd been hoping for, understanding. She didn't apologize yet. The hurt was still too raw, but she saw the truth now. And that alone felt like a door opening. Ethan stood off to the side, shrinking beneath the weight of a storm he had helped create. And Julia, drained and quiet, finally looked at me without anger. It didn't fix everything, but it broke the cycle we'd been trapped in for years. Lila asked to see the paperwork herself, her voice thin and shaking, as though she already feared what she would find. Ron handed her the folder with careful hands, and as she flipped through the pages, the color drained from her face. Each receipt, each time stamp, each payment carried my name. Quiet acts of protection she once mistook for control. She pressed her lips together, fighting the rise of emotion behind her eyes. Ethan watched from the side, guilt spreading across his features like ink in water, but he didn't move toward her. He knew he had no right, and as Lila stood there, reading the proof of everything I had silently covered, something inside her seemed to break open and collapse at the same time. When Lila reached the page showing the largest penalty, the one tied directly to Ethan's financial mess, her breath hitched. She lifted her head toward him slowly, her expression hollow as though she didn't recognize the man she'd planned to marry. Ethan opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. Guilt and fear tangled in his throat until all he could manage was a whisper of her name. Lila didn't respond. Her silence was louder than any accusation, and in that moment, Ethan crumbled. He looked at me as if hoping I'd step in like I always had, but this time, I didn't. Lila needed clarity, not another shield, and Ethan needed to face the truth he'd run from for too long. Lila asked Ron to confirm every detail, each payment, each penalty, each deadline, and he did so with a calm, steady professionalism that left no room for misinterpretation. Each confirmation cut through another layer of denial until Lila's shoulders slumped and her breath trembled. Julia watched the unraveling with a strange mixture of pity and discomfort, realizing her bitterness had only fueled the wrong fire. I stood quietly, letting Lila process everything without stepping in. She needed to see the truth without my voice shaping it, and as Ron closed the folder gently, Lila wiped her eyes, her gaze falling to the ground, like she wasn't sure she deserved to lift it again. At last, Lila turned toward me fully, her voice barely more than a whisper, as she asked why I hadn't told her, why I had carried all of this alone. The guilt in her eyes was almost unbearable. I wanted to tell her everything at once, that I did it because I loved her, because I wanted her day to be special, because I didn't want her to feel embarrassed by Ethan's mistakes, but I kept it simple. I told her I wanted her happiness more than anything, and that sometimes love means carrying weight someone else shouldn't have to. Her face crumpled, and for the first time that night, she reached for me. Not in anger, not in panic, but in the fragile way a daughter reaches for her mother when she finally sees the truth. Lila collapsed into my arms with a sob that echoed through the courtyard, her weight sinking against me, as though she'd been holding herself up for far too long. Her tears were hot on my shoulder, but her words were soft, broken apologies spilling out one after another. I held her gently, not to erase the pain, but to let her know she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan washed, his face tight with regret, understanding that he had lost far more than a wedding. And Julia, drained of her resentment, looked away with a quiet sorrow that suggested she finally grasped the damage her whispers had caused. For the first time all night, the air felt still. Not tense, not chaotic, just still, like the first moment of calm after a devastating storm. The courtyard had quieted to a heavy calm, the kind of silence that arrives only after every truth has been dragged into the open. Lila pulled back from my embrace slowly, wiping her cheeks with shaking fingers as her eyes drifted toward Ethan. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. Her voice was quiet, almost too gentle, as she asked him the only question that mattered. Why didn't you trust me? Ethan's expression broke, his guilt swallowing any excuse he might have rehearsed. Julia stepped back, no longer part of the story. Her bitterness drained into something hollow, and as the night air settled, Lila stood in the painful clarity of someone who finally sees the truth, without anyone else holding the pieces. Ethan tried to explain, but his words stumbled apart before they could form meaning. He admitted he'd been terrified of losing her, terrified of disappointing her, terrified of being seen for who he really was. Lila listened with a stillness that carried more weight than anger ever could. She didn't interrupt, didn't comfort him, didn't reach for him. She simply absorbed the truth, her face reflecting each layer of betrayal he had hidden. When he finally said he thought love meant pretending you had everything handled, something inside her seemed to exhale the last of her denial. She realized love that hides truth isn't love. It's fear wearing a mask, and she'd lived under that mask for far too long. Lila finally spoke, and her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there before. She told Ethan she couldn't build a marriage on secrets he expected her to carry blindly. She told him trust wasn't optional, and love wasn't supposed to be something she had to earn by ignoring red flags. Ethan's eyes welled as he reached toward her, but she stepped back. Not out of punishment, but out of understanding that stepping forward would only repeat the cycle she had watched between me and Julia. Her gaze then shifted to me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in her since she was little: clarity. She realized the difference between a mistake and a pattern, and Ethan had built a pattern he wasn't ready to break. Lila turned to me again, her voice softening as she whispered an apology that trembled through both of us. She apologized for the accusations, for the blindness, for letting her fear make her cruel. I didn't need her to list every wound. Her eyes already carried the weight of everything left unsaid. I told her I had never expected perfection, only honesty, and that I didn't want my love to feel like pressure she had to outrun. She cried harder, not from shame but from relief, finally understanding that I had protected her not to control her, but because I couldn't bear watching her carry a burden that wasn't hers. For the first time all night, her heart felt like it was finding its way back home. When the night finally settled into its quietest hour, the last confrontation had already transformed into something heavier but cleaner. A truth everyone could finally breathe through. Lila didn't return to Ethan. She didn't scream, didn't demand, didn't cling to the dream she had tried so hard to protect. Instead, she stood beside me and made a choice: to step away, to rebuild, to learn who she was without someone else's mistakes defining her future. Julia approached hesitantly, a soft apology forming in her eyes, even if her voice couldn't yet shape it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger toward her, just a tired hope that maybe we could stop hurting each other. The venue lights dimmed, the crowd dissolved, and in the stillness that remained, I finally felt something that had been missing for a long time: peace.